I woke up that morning to the sound of Amy's footsteps, light but hurried, moving around our bedroom. She was already dressed, a stark contrast to her usual slow routine. Normally, she'd linger in bed, sip her coffee while scrolling through her phone, but today, something was off. I watched her for a moment, my eyes barely open, before she noticed me. "Morning," she said, her voice quick and distracted. She didn't even look at me as she grabbed her bag from the closet. "Morning," I replied, watching her closely. "You're up early." "I've got to meet a client," she said without stopping, already halfway out the door. No kiss, no lingering look, just gone. Something tightened in my chest. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed the change. She had been distant for weeks now, maybe longer. At first, I chalked it up to work stress or one of her health club clients causing her trouble. But the excuses, the long nights out, the sudden bursts of affection when she felt guilty, they were becoming patterns. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling. The quiet of the room wrapped around me, but my mind was loud, replaying moments. The late-night texts she shielded from me, the scent of a different perfume that clung to her clothes when she came home late. The new lingerie I'd found stuffed in the back of her drawer, something I'd never seen her wear for me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. After all, we'd been together for almost 12 years. Our relationship was solid, or at least it used to be. But doubt had a way of creeping in, even when you tried to shut it out. Today, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I got out of bed and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. As I looked at myself in the mirror, the reflection staring back seemed calm, but underneath, a storm was brewing. I was the kind of guy who paid attention to details. In business, that had served me well. I didn't let things slip. That's how I'd climbed the corporate ladder, securing a comfortable life for both of us. But now, those same instincts were telling me something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Later that night, Amy was distant again. She picked at her dinner, her eyes flickering between me and her phone, which lay face down on the table, a habit she'd picked up in the last month. I wanted to ask her what was going on, to confront her about the long hours and the late nights, but I held back. Instead, I waited. I watched. And that's when I saw it. Her phone buzzed quietly against the table, the screen lighting up for a brief second, just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of the message. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." Gee, my stomach dropped, and everything inside me screamed at me to grab her phone, demand answers. But I didn't. I kept my face neutral, kept chewing, kept acting like nothing had changed. She picked up the phone casually, glanced at it, then slid it into her pocket, all without a second thought. I wanted to throw my plate against the wall, wanted to yell at her, accuse her, demand to know who the hell G was. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, asked her how her days went, and pretended like everything was fine. That night, lying next to her, my mind wouldn't shut off. The thought of her with someone else, G, made my skin crawl. What was she doing when she said she was working late? Who was she with when she claimed she was meeting clients? My heart raced as a cold, bitter realization crept in. She was cheating. The signs had been there for weeks, but I hadn't wanted to see them. Now there was no denying it. I wasn't the paranoid husband I thought I was. I was the fool who had missed the truth right in front of him. I had two choices: confront her and watch her lie through her teeth, or find out everything first. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof, the kind that would strip away any excuses she could throw at me. And when I had it, she would regret ever thinking she could betray me and get away with it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Amy had already left for another client meeting, so I took my time. I sat in the quiet kitchen staring at my coffee cup, my mind calculating my next move. I wasn't a man driven by impulse. No, if I was going to handle this, I'd do it right. I'd be methodical, precise. First, I needed access to her phone. I wasn't tech savvy, but I knew how to dig. Over the next few days, I researched discrete tracking apps, ones that could be installed without her knowing. I practiced, ensuring that once I had her phone, it would only take a few minutes to get what I needed. That night, as she slept, I carefully reached over, taking her phone from the nightstand. My pulse quickened, but I kept my movements steady. Within minutes, I had the app installed and the phone was back in place. She didn't stir. The next day, while Amy went about her day, I watched everything unfold on my screen. Every text, every call, every location she visited. It was all there. And it didn't take long for me to confirm what I already knew. There were dozens of texts between her and G, whose full name I quickly learned was Greg, a lawyer at a firm downtown. They met often, their messages littered with flirtation and explicit details that made my blood boil. But I didn't explode. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I gathered more information, reading through their conversations, following their meeting spots. Every word was a dagger, but I kept my cool, kept planning. I wasn't going to ruin this by acting too soon. No, she was going to feel the weight of what she'd done, slowly, painfully. As the days passed, my resentment grew, but so did my resolve. I knew her routine now. I knew where she went, who she was with, and exactly how far she had fallen. The woman I once trusted was gone, replaced by a liar, a cheat. And yet, as I gathered more proof, I couldn't help but wonder why. What had I missed? What had I done or not done that had pushed her into another man's arms? Part of me wanted answers, but a larger part of me didn't care. Whatever reason she had, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I was going to take everything from her, just like she'd taken everything from me. I sat in my office that evening staring at the messages I had saved on my screen. Amy had just sent Greg another message, confirming their next meeting. This time, though, I wasn't angry. I felt nothing, because this was just the beginning. She had no idea what was coming. I spent the next few days in a haze of quiet observation. It was strange how, once you knew the truth, everything became so painfully clear. Amy's excuses sounded rehearsed, her absences more conspicuous. The way she avoided eye contact during dinner, or how she'd go to the bathroom just before bed, leaving her phone behind for only a few seconds too long. I noticed everything now. Every little detail screamed betrayal, and I couldn't look at her without feeling my insides twist into knots. But I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to confront her yet. No, I needed more. I needed to understand the full scope of her deception, and I needed her to feel it too, the weight of her lies crushing down on her, just like they were crushing me. The app I installed on her phone fed me everything. Every message, every call, every location. I was tethered to her digital life, watching as she spiraled deeper into her affair with Greg. They had their little routine down to a science, texting during the day while I was at work, meeting up in discreet locations around town, usually at a hotel or sometimes at his office after hours. The more I uncovered, the more it disgusted me, and yet I couldn't look away. The worst part was how normal she acted when she was around me, like nothing had changed, like I was still her husband, the man she'd come home to every night. But I could see it in her eyes now, guilt, hidden behind those practiced smiles and hollow reassurances. It was there, just beneath the surface. She thought she was being clever, that I hadn't noticed the subtle shifts. But I had. I saw it all. One night as we sat on the couch together, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and for a moment, I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes before she quickly turned the screen away from me. "Work?" I asked, feigning indifference. She nodded. "Yeah, one of my clients has a question." I smiled at her. "You're always so busy." She gave a short, strained laugh. "Yeah, it's been crazy lately." I watched her as she responded to the message, her fingers moving quickly over the screen, the tension in her shoulders telling me everything I needed to know. She thought she had me fooled, thought she could keep playing this game without me catching on. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My phone was already buzzing, the app syncing with her latest messages. The words flashed across my screen, confirming what I already knew. "Meet me tomorrow, same place?" And Greg's response, "Can't wait." I stared at the screen for a long moment, my hand tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but I forced it back down. Now wasn't the time to lose control. Now was the time to strategize. By the time I returned to the living room, Amy was already preparing to go to bed, her phone tucked away in her purse. She gave me a small smile before heading upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next morning, I watched her get ready again, just like I had the day before, and the day before that. Her routine was the same, distant, quick, and filled with lies. But today I knew where she was going, I knew who she'd be with, and I knew what I needed to do next. Once she left, I went to my office, closing the door behind me. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the messages I had saved between her and Greg. There were hundreds of them now, dating back weeks, maybe even months. I scrolled through them, reading each line, each promise they made to each other. It was disgusting, and yet it was exactly what I needed. I compiled everything into a folder, screenshots of the messages, logs of her locations, even some of the more explicit photos they had exchanged. I saved it all, backing it up onto multiple drives. This was my insurance, my leverage. I wasn't going to use it yet, but when the time came, Amy and Greg would have no room to wiggle out of this. But it wasn't just the affair I needed to know about. If I was going to destroy her, I needed to know everything. And that's when I turned my attention to Greg. He wasn't just some random guy Amy had picked up. He was a well-known lawyer in town, successful, respected, with a reputation to uphold. I started digging, looking into his background, his connections, his business dealings. It didn't take long to find the cracks in his perfect image. Greg wasn't as clean as he appeared to be. He had ties to some questionable people, clients with shady business ventures, deals that didn't quite add up. I wasn't surprised. Men like him always had something to hide. I spent hours combing through legal records, financial documents, and anything else I could get my hands on. The more I dug, the more dirt I uncovered. Greg had been playing a dangerous game for a long time, and it was only a matter of time before someone like me came along and toppled his carefully constructed empire. But that was a plan for later. For now, I needed to focus on Amy. The following day, she left for another one of her so-called client meetings, and I followed her. I stayed a safe distance behind, my heart pounding as I watched her pull into a hotel parking lot. It was almost laughable how predictable she had become. She had no idea I was there, watching her every move. She met Greg in the lobby, her face lighting up as soon as she saw him. They didn't even try to hide it, holding hands as they walked toward the elevators. I watched them disappear behind the elevator doors, and for a brief moment, I wondered if this was it. If this was the moment I should confront her, make a scene, tear their little fantasy world apart. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I took pictures. I documented everything, from the moment she arrived to the moment she left. I followed them to their next destination, another hotel, another secret meeting. It was all so routine, so disgustingly normal for them. But for me, it was fuel. Every kiss they shared, every glance, every touch, it was all ammunition. By the time I got home, I had enough evidence to bury her. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. That night, Amy came home late again, claiming she'd been at the gym. I nodded, playing along, acting like the trusting husband I had been for far too long. Inside, though, I was seething. She had no idea that I had watched her every move, that I had followed her, that I knew every dirty little secret she thought she was hiding. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, her back to me as she poured herself a glass of water. She looked so calm, so at ease, like nothing had changed, like I didn't know everything. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She turned, offering me a tired smile. "Yeah, it was rough. Just glad to be home." I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Glad to have you home." She didn't notice the coldness in my tone, or if she did, she ignored it. We went through the motions, dinner, small talk, bedtime. But the distance between us had never felt so wide. As she slept beside me that night, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The anger I had been holding on to for weeks now simmered just beneath the surface, but I kept it in check. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. I glanced over at her, watching as she slept peacefully, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. She had no idea how far I had gone, how deep I had dug, how much I had uncovered. But she would soon. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to dismantle everything she had built, piece by piece. She was going to feel every ounce of betrayal she had inflicted on me, multiplied tenfold. And when I was done, she wouldn't just regret her affair. She would regret ever thinking she could deceive me. The time was coming. Soon I would pull the trigger on everything I had planned. Amy thought she was in control, but she had no idea how far ahead I was. This was just the beginning. I needed to make sure my next steps were flawless. Now that I had gathered enough proof, it wasn't just about knowing the truth. It was about turning the truth into a weapon. I could have blown up her world in an instant, but that would have been too easy, too quick. No, she needed to feel the pain that had been festering inside me, and it needed to be slow. The first step was gathering more information on Greg. I needed to understand his life, his vulnerabilities, and most importantly, what would destroy him. He wasn't just Amy's lover, he was a key piece in the puzzle I was building. If I could take him down first, the rest would crumble effortlessly. I spent hours digging into his financials, accessing public records and databases. His law firm had a spotless reputation on the surface, but beneath that veneer, it was a nest of corruption. A few well-placed calls to some acquaintances in the legal world confirmed my suspicions. Greg was dirty, and he wasn't just skimming from his clients. There were whispers of money laundering, off-the-books deals with shady businesses, and tax evasion. It was exactly what I needed. I'd already found out where they met, hotels, restaurants, and even his office. It was all methodical, predictable. They probably thought they were clever, keeping their meetings low-key, but they were idiots. I pieced together their routine, knowing when and where they would meet next. That's when I started planting the seeds. Step 1. Make Greg sweat. I hacked into his email and began leaving breadcrumbs. A flagged message here, an inquiry from a concerned client about the firm's shady dealings there. I didn't leave anything too obvious at first, just enough to make him paranoid. I could already picture him sweating over his inbox, wondering if someone had found out. The beauty of it was that he wouldn't even be able to tell anyone, not without exposing himself. But that wasn't enough. I needed more. Greg wasn't just going to lose his reputation. He was going to lose everything, and Amy would be caught in the fallout. I wasn't sure how far I could take it until I met Greg's wife, Charlotte. Charlotte was an innocent player in all of this, and I almost felt guilty as I approached her. Almost. She was sharp, intelligent, and entirely unaware of the affair her husband had been carrying on for months. I created a new identity, an out-of-town client, interested in hiring Greg's firm, and I made sure I had enough reasons to meet Charlotte. It wasn't difficult. She handled the firm's PR, and I used that to my advantage. Over the next few weeks, I slipped into conversations with her as if I were just another client, slowly befriending her. Charlotte had no idea she was being manipulated, no idea that I was gathering pieces of information from her, little by little. Through casual talks over coffee, I learned about Greg's habits, his routines, and most importantly, the tensions in their marriage. Once I had Charlotte in my orbit, I started tightening the noose. I'd listen to her talk about Greg's late nights and his constant need to be out of town for work. She didn't know it, but every conversation we had confirmed what I already knew. It gave me the leverage I needed. If Greg ever tried to crawl out from under what I was going to do, I had Charlotte ready to topple him. But none of this mattered if Amy didn't crack first. I began sowing doubts in her mind. It was subtle at first. I started making small comments, offhand remarks about her phone, a curious glance when she'd come home late, just enough to make her second-guess herself. She'd fidget more when I asked how her day had been, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I didn't accuse her of anything outright, but I let her feel my suspicion. It was a form of psychological warfare, and I was winning. The first real crack appeared one night when we were sitting at dinner. Amy was talking about her day, rambling on about clients at the gym, but I wasn't really listening. I was watching her body language, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table a little too tight, how her foot tapped nervously under her chair. Something wrong? I asked, keeping my voice casual. She hesitated. No, why? I leaned back, giving her a smile that I knew would unsettle her. You just seem a little tense. Anything you want to talk about? Her eyes flickered down to her plate, and for a moment I thought she was going to crack right then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled weakly and shook her head. No, everything's fine. Liar. But that was the point. I wanted her to lie, to keep digging herself deeper into the hole she didn't even know I'd created for her. I continued my routine over the next few weeks, gathering more information on Greg, manipulating Charlotte, and playing mind games with Amy. I watched her unravel slowly, bit by bit, and it gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. The woman I'd once trusted with everything was now the one hiding in plain sight, trapped by her own deception. But there was still a part of me that hesitated. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, I couldn't completely kill the memory of the woman I had loved. Sometimes I'd find myself thinking about the good times, the early years of our marriage when we were still happy, still real. Those memories would creep in, uninvited, and for a brief second I'd wonder if this was all a mistake. But then I'd catch a glimpse of her phone lighting up with another message from Greg, and the rage would come flooding back. Whatever love I had for her was gone, replaced by something colder, darker. She had killed it the moment she decided to betray me. The next phase of my plan was to make Amy doubt Greg. I hacked into his email again, planting messages from a disgruntled client, warning him that someone was looking into his affairs. I made sure those emails would be vague enough to cause alarm, but not enough for Greg to pinpoint exactly who was behind them. Soon enough, I saw the cracks in their perfect little relationship. Amy became more anxious, her text to Greg filled with paranoia, asking if everything was okay. Greg tried to reassure her, but I knew better. The stress was eating him alive, and I made sure to keep the pressure on. It was only a matter of time before their relationship crumbled. Then came the final blow. I'd gathered enough information on Greg's illegal dealings to blow up his entire career, but I wanted it to happen in a way that would drag Amy down with him. I hacked into his firm's financial records, compiling evidence of his dirty transactions. Then I leaked it to a few key contacts in the media. It didn't take long for the story to hit. A local news outlet picked up the scandal, and within hours, Greg's life started falling apart. His clients dropped him, his firm was under investigation, and the legal world that once revered him now shunned him. He was scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. And Amy, she was caught in the middle of it all. Her world came crashing down as Greg's troubles bled into their relationship. The texts between them became frantic, Greg accusing her of being too needy, Amy begging him to stay. They fought more, their once secret affair now a volatile mess. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, knowing that I had orchestrated every last piece of their destruction. But I wasn't done. The final part of my plan involved exposing Amy's affair in the most public way possible. I needed to make sure that she couldn't hide behind any excuses, that everyone, our friends, our family, knew exactly who she was. I waited for the right moment, and it came sooner than I expected. One evening, we were invited to a company event, a gala hosted by one of my firm's biggest clients. Amy and I walked in together, all smiles, the perfect couple. But underneath, I could feel the tension radiating from her. She knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Toward the end of the night, I excused myself to the restroom, slipping away from the crowd. I took out my phone and pulled up the message I had prepared days ago, a compilation of every text, every photo, every piece of evidence that proved her affair with Greg. Then with a single tap, I sent it to every contact on her phone, including her closest friends and family. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Amy's phone buzzed incessantly, and I watched as her face turned pale, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what had just happened. She fumbled with her phone, trying to stop the messages, but it was too late. The damage was done. I stood back, watching as the room slowly turned on her, people whispering, glancing in her direction, their expressions filled with shock and judgment. Amy's perfect world had just been shattered, and there was no coming back from this. By the time we left the event, she was a mess, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. She tried to talk to me, to explain, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I just drove us home in silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy in the air. This was only the beginning. When we got home after the gala, Amy barely spoke. The shock had silenced her, and her mind was racing, just like I had planned. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as we moved through the house, her fingers trembling as she hung up her coat. She hadn't even unlocked her phone since the disaster at the event, probably too scared to see what damage had been done. I knew the questions were coming. They had to be, but I wasn't going to rush it. I stayed calm, methodical. "Do you want a drink?" I asked, my voice smooth, offering a strange contrast to the tension that filled the room. She turned toward me, her face pale. For a moment, she looked like she was going to collapse. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. I grabbed 2 glasses from the cabinet, poured us both whiskey, and handed her one. She took it, her hands shaking as she brought it to her lips. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything crashing down on her, but not yet touching me. I felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. I'd waited too long for this moment to feel anything other than cold satisfaction. Finally, she spoke. Did you know?" Her voice cracked. I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the moment. "Did I know what?" Her eyes darted to the floor, avoiding mine. I could see the fear rising inside her, the panic bubbling up, threatening to spill over. She swallowed hard, trying to collect herself. "About Greg, about everything." I let the silence hang between us for a moment, letting her squirm. "I've known for months, Amy." Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in shock. She looked at me like a cornered animal, realizing too late that I'd been hunting her all along. "Months?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, setting my glass down on the counter and leaning back against the sink, crossing my arms. "Months. I've watched everything, every lie, every excuse. I know where you've been, who you've been with, and I know what you've done." The color drained from her face as my words sunk in. "Michael, I'm sorry. Sorry? Oof-aw," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You're sorry now?" I let out a bitter laugh. "You weren't sorry when you were sneaking around behind my back. You weren't sorry when you were destroying everything we had. So don't tell me you're sorry now, Amy. It's too late for that." Her face crumbled, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling down her cheeks. She reached out toward me, desperate. "Please, Michael, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I love you, I swear." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice colder than ice. "Don't you dare say you love me. You wouldn't have done this if you did." I watched as she recoiled, her sobs now uncontrollable. It was everything I had imagined. The guilt, the fear, the helplessness, it was all finally sinking in for her. But for me, it was just another part of the plan. I walked past her, heading toward the living room. "Sit down," I said over my shoulder. She followed me, still shaking, and sank into the couch. I grabbed the folder I'd prepared, thick with every piece of evidence I'd collected, and dropped it onto the coffee table in front of her. Her hands hovered over the folder, hesitant to open it, as though touching it would make all of this real. I didn't give her the choice. "Open it." She obeyed, her hands trembling as she lifted the cover. The first few pages were screenshots, text between her and Greg, pictures of them meeting in hotels, calls they'd exchanged. I watched her face as she flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror. When she reached the financial records, her breath hitched. "You thought I didn't know about Greg's dirty little business deals, didn't you?" I asked, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You thought I'd just let it slide, but I've known everything for a while now. You really had no idea who you were dealing with." Her eyes darted to mine, wide with fear. "Michael, what did you do?" I leaned back, watching the realization hit her. "Greg's finished, Amy. His entire career is in ruins thanks to me. And everything you've built with him, every lie, every secret, it's all coming down with him. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, no, this can't be happening. Oh, it's happening, I said, standing up and walking toward the window. And it's only just begun. I watched her as she collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face, sobbing uncontrollably. But I didn't feel a thing. Not pity, not remorse. This was what she deserved. Every tear, every ounce of regret, it was all hers to bear. I let her sit there, crumbling under the weight of her own actions. I wasn't done yet, but this was for her. She needed to feel it, to understand that the life she tried to build behind my back was gone. After what felt like an eternity, she finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What, what are you going to do to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face her, crossing my arms. You think this is about Greg? About exposing him? No, Amy, this is about you. You're going to lose everything. I paused, letting the words sink in. You think you've suffered already? This is just the beginning. I'm going to take away everything you care about, your reputation, your friends, your security. And I'm going to make sure you know it's we all because of you. She shook her head, her tears now turning to panic. No, please, Michael, you can't. Watch me. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but I was done listening. I turned away from her, walking toward the door. Where are you going? She called after me, her voice desperate. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. I've got some business to take care of. You can sit here and think about what's coming next. And with that, I walked out, leaving her alone to drown in her guilt. The next few days were crucial. Greg's life was already unraveling, his firm under investigation, his clients abandoning him. I'd made sure that every step of his downfall was public, ensuring that it would drag Amy down with him. The whispers were already starting, rumors of her involvement with him, of her complicity in his crimes. It was only a matter of time before the full story broke. But it wasn't enough, not yet. I spent the next week ensuring that every detail of my plan was perfect. I worked silently, behind the scenes, watching as Amy became more isolated, more desperate. Her phone calls to friends went unanswered, her texts ignored. I could see the cracks forming in her, and I knew it was time for the next phase. It was a Wednesday when I walked into the house, the air heavy with tension. Amy was sitting at the kitchen table staring blankly at her phone. She didn't even look up when I entered. Michael, she whispered, her voice raw. Everyone knows. I don't know how to fix this. I stood over her, watching as she broke down again, the weight of everything finally crushing her. You don't, I said coldly. There's no fixing this, Amy. This is your life now. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. Please, what do you want from me? I'll do anything. Anything? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded frantically, desperation seeping into every part of her. Please, Michael, just tell me what to do. I leaned down, close enough that she could feel the coldness in my words. I want you to live with this every day. I want you to wake up knowing that you destroyed your life, and there's nothing you can do to change it. Her face crumpled, and she collapsed into sobs once again. I straightened up, walking out of the kitchen without another word. There was nothing left to say. The plan was in motion, and I had no intention of stopping it. The next morning, the news broke about Greg's arrest. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. He was charged with it all. Amy's connection to him was plastered all over the headlines, her reputation in ruins. Friends who once stood by her side now turned their backs, and I watched as she tried, unsuccessfully, to pick up the pieces. I stayed quiet through it all, watching her unravel just as I had planned. Every tear, every phone call that went unanswered, every ounce of regret, I savored it all. This was what she deserved. This was what I had worked for. Amy had no idea how deep my revenge went, how meticulously I had planned every part of her destruction. But now she was beginning to understand. And soon she would lose everything, just like I had. Amy stood in the doorway, staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and terror. Her life, meticulously constructed with lies, was crumbling faster than she could grasp. She didn't know how far I'd gone, how much I had already taken from her. But she would soon. Tonight I would deliver the final blow. The past week had been brutal for her. The news of Greg's arrest for fraud and tax evasion had spread like wildfire. Her connection to him was whispered about in every social circle she had once belonged to. Friends who used to admire her now shunned her, and the phone calls that once flooded in with party invitations or lunch plans were eerily silent. She was a pariah. I watched her unravel from a distance, careful not to show any sign of gloating. The plan had been too intricate, too perfect to risk exposing my satisfaction. But now it was time to end this, to make her understand the full weight of her betrayal. I had been patient long enough. She stood in the kitchen, the dim light casting shadows over her face, making her look even more fragile. Her hands shook as she reached for a glass of water, spilling some on the counter. I let her fumble for a moment, watching as her fear settled deeper into her bones. "Michael, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the same broken plea I had heard countless times over the last few days. Each time I ignored it, watching her twist in the storm she created. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms, and raised an eyebrow. "Talk? What's left to talk about, Amy?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she placed the glass down, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was stupid. I made a mistake. But you—" Her voice caught in her throat as the sobs came. "You have to stop this. Please, Michael. I can't take any more." I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air, filling the space between us with the pathetic sounds of her regret. She was begging, desperate, just like I had planned. This was what I had waited for. Not the revenge itself, but the moment when she would finally understand the depths of her failure. "Stop what?" I asked coldly. "Stop making you face the consequences of your choices?" "You don't understand," she stammered. "I didn't want to hurt you. It was never about you. I was lost, confused." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through her excuses. "Don't insult me, Amy. This was never about you being lost. It was about you being selfish. You wanted more, and now you've got it." Her face twisted in anguish as she realized there was no escape from this. She had nowhere to turn, no one left to rely on. Greg was gone, his wealth and power stripped from him, his name tarnished beyond repair. Her friends had abandoned her, and now the only person she had left was the man she had betrayed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Michael, just give me a chance to fix it." "I'll do anything." I pushed myself off the counter and walked toward her, my footsteps slow and deliberate. "Anything?" I repeated, mocking her. "What could you possibly do to fix this, Amy? You've already lost." She flinched, backing away slightly as I approached. The fear in her eyes was real now, and it gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. I had become the monster she had created, and now she was facing it. I stopped just inches from her, staring down at the wreck of a woman I had once loved. "You think this is just about Greg?" "About the affair?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "This is about you tearing apart everything we built. It's about you betraying me in the worst way possible and thinking you could get away with it." Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing left for her to say that would change anything. I pulled out a folder from behind me and placed it on the kitchen table between us. She stared at it, confused, before looking up at me. What is that?" I stepped back, folding my arms again. "That's everything? Bank statements, asset transfers, divorce papers. It's the last piece of your destruction." Her face paled as she reached for the folder with trembling hands, flipping it open to reveal the cold, hard truth. While she had been focused on Greg, I had been systematically dismantling our financial life. Everything we owned together was gone. The house, the savings, the investments, all transferred quietly into accounts she had no access to. She had nothing left. You. You can't do this, she breathed, her voice barely audible. Michael, please. I smiled, cold and devoid of any compassion. It's already done. While you were out chasing your affair, I made sure you'd have nothing to come back to. I've already filed for divorce. You'll sign those papers, and when this is over, you'll be left with exactly what you deserve. She gasped, her hands shaking as she clutched the papers in front of her. You can't take everything. I I need time. I can fix this. We can fix this. There's no fixing this, Amy. You destroyed it all when you decided Greg was worth more than your own family. Her sobs filled the room as she sank into the chair, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. But I felt nothing. This was justice. This was the final step in her unraveling. She had torn apart everything I held dear, and now I had done the same to her. But I wasn't done yet. There's one more thing, I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded with the adrenaline of the moment. I stepped toward the kitchen window, looking out into the dark night, before turning back to face her. I made sure everyone knows. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto mine, confusion briefly flickering before terror took over. What? What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and opened the message I had sent just hours before, the one containing all the details of her affair, the evidence I had gathered, the receipts, and the photographs. Every sordid detail of her betrayal laid bare. I sent it to everyone. Your family, your friends, my colleagues, everyone knows what you are, Amy. There's no hiding it now. Her face contorted in horror as she grabbed for her own phone, frantically swiping through the dozens of messages and missed calls that had flooded in. I watched as she broke, completely and utterly, the last remnants of her life shattering before her eyes. No, 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 no. She muttered under her breath, her hands trembling violently as she struggled to comprehend the full extent of what I had done. Her world was collapsing, and there was no one to save her. The sobs that followed were guttural, raw. She was beyond desperate now, beyond any semblance of dignity. And I watched, feeling nothing. You destroyed us, Amy, I said, my voice quiet but firm. And now you get to live with it. She collapsed onto the floor, the weight of her shame and guilt too much to bear. Her cries echoed through the house, but I stood there unmoved. I had waited for this moment, prepared for it, and now that it had arrived, I felt no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness, where my vengeance should have brought me peace. The woman I had once loved was gone, and so was I. I turned and walked away, leaving her to her misery. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to do. The revenge was complete, and yet, as I stepped out into the night air, I realized the truth of it all. In destroying her, I had destroyed myself. I stood there staring up at the dark sky, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. Amy was ruined, Greg was gone, and everything I had planned had gone perfectly. But as the cold air bit into my skin, I understood the cost of it all. The man I had been, the husband, the father, the partner, he was gone, buried beneath the ruins of my own vengeance. There was no turning back now. I walked down the empty street, the sound of her cries still echoing faintly behind me, and for the first time since this all began, I wasn't sure if I had truly won. I walked down the empty street, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The adrenaline that had fueled me for so long was finally ebbing, leaving me hollow. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. I'd done what I had set out to do. Amy was destroyed, and so was Greg. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Yet with each step, a gnawing emptiness settled deeper inside me. Revenge. It had been my entire focus for months. Every sleepless night, every calculated move. It all led to this. I had won. But now that the dust was settling, I couldn't shake the weight pressing down on me, the weight of everything I'd sacrificed along the way. The man I used to be was gone, lost in the wreckage of this plan. I couldn't pinpoint when it had happened. Somewhere between gathering evidence and executing my revenge, I had crossed a line, maybe multiple lines, And now, standing here with nothing but the ruins of my old life behind me, I had to ask myself, was it worth it? I glanced back at the house where Amy's sobs still lingered faintly in the air. She was destroyed, yes, but I wasn't the same man who had walked into that house months ago, filled with righteous fury and a desire to make her pay. What had I gained, really? The love we once had, the life we had built. It was gone, and not just because of her affair. I had obliterated it myself, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but ashes. I kept walking, my mind swirling with thoughts I had been avoiding for far too long. Divorce. That was next. The papers were ready, neatly filed, and waiting for her signature. Our children would be staying with me, and Amy would be left with nothing. It was the perfect end to this nightmare, at least on paper. But life didn't work like that, did it? This wasn't a clean victory. There were no parades, no celebrations. Just the cold realization that in tearing Amy's world apart, I had torn mine apart too. I had severed the last fragile ties to who I once was, and now I didn't know who I'd become. I paused, staring out over the quiet street, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel something other than anger. Regret. It hit me like a tidal wave, crashing into the hollow parts of me that had been numbed by my obsession. The man I had been before, he wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have destroyed someone he had once loved with such cruelty, no matter the betrayal. I didn't regret bringing down Greg. He deserved everything he got. The fraud, the lies. He was a parasite who had leached off others. But Amy, she was different. She had been my wife, the mother of my children. And though I knew she had hurt me in ways I could never fully forgive, I couldn't help but wonder if there had been another way. A way to walk away from her betrayal without becoming something worse than the pain she had inflicted. I thought about the moments before everything unraveled, the years when our life together had seemed solid. Sure, we had our problems, like any couple, but there was love, or at least I had thought there was. And now, with nothing but the echoes of those memories left, I couldn't help but question if I had let my rage consume me beyond repair. I leaned against the brick wall of a building, my breath forming clouds in the night air. What had I really gained from all this? Amy was ruined, but what did that leave me with? An empty house, full custody of the children, a hollow victory that tasted more like ash with every passing moment. I took out my phone, scrolling through the messages I had sent earlier that evening. All the evidence of Amy's affair, blasted out to her family, friends, colleagues, everything that could destroy her reputation in one fell swoop. It had felt like justice in the moment. Now looking at it, I wasn't sure if it had been necessary. What was I trying to prove? That I had the power to hurt her as much as she had hurt me? That I could erase her from our lives like she had tried to erase her vows? It felt petty now, small. Revenge had become my entire identity, but now that it was over, what was left? I shoved the phone back in my pocket and started walking again, my thoughts growing darker with every step. I had imagined that once I had destroyed her, I would feel some kind of release, but there was no release, no satisfaction. I felt as trapped in this mess as I had when I first discovered her betrayal. I crossed the street, heading toward the park where I used to bring the kids when they were younger. The swings creaked in the distance, swaying gently in the breeze. I hadn't been here in years, not since things started to fall apart with Amy. It used to be a place of joy, a place where we built memories together as a family. Now it just felt like another ghost from a life I couldn't get back. I sat down on one of the benches, the cold metal biting into my skin. I stared out at the empty playground, my mind wandering back to the last few months. Had I been so blinded by my need for revenge that I hadn't considered the long-term consequences? What would this do to our children? Would they grow up resenting me for destroying their mother? A part of me wanted to believe that they would understand, that they would see it as justice, as something that had to be done. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how things worked. Life wasn't a simple equation where you could add up the wrongs and get an equal outcome. I had to face the reality that I wasn't the hero in this story. I wasn't even sure I was the villain. I was something in between. something broken and twisted by anger and pain. And now, sitting here in the quiet of the night, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could keep walking down this path of destruction, letting it consume me, or I could try to find a way back. But was there even a way back? The thought of rebuilding my life without Amy, without the person I had once trusted more than anyone, felt daunting. The future stretched out before me like a dark void, full of uncertainty. I had destroyed her, but in doing so, I had lost a part of myself that I wasn't sure I could ever recover. The swings creaked again, and I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I had to move forward. There was no undoing what I had done, but I could choose what came next. The divorce would be final soon. Me would sign the papers, and we would go our separate ways. The children would be with me, but I couldn't keep them from her forever. They would need to know their mother, and I would have to live with the fact that I had destroyed her in their eyes as well. Was that really what I wanted? I opened my eyes, staring out at the park. Maybe there was another way. Maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild something from the ruins. Not with Amy, but for the sake of the children. For the sake of the man I used to be. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation was easy, but I had to trot on. I couldn't let revenge define me for the rest of my life. I had to let go of the hatred, the anger that had consumed me. If I didn't, I knew it would destroy me too. I stood up from the bench, the cold biting at my skin again. But this time I welcomed it. It reminded me that I was still alive, that I still had a chance to be something more than the man who had torn everything apart. As I walked back toward the house, I made a silent promise to myself. I would rebuild. Not for Amy, not for anyone else, but for me. And maybe, just maybe in time, I would find a way to forgive, both her and myself. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it might not happen at all. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had a choice, and that was enough for now.